Hello, my name is Emma Rosh, and I'm the Ecological Restoration Technician at Goose Sanctuary. Unfortunately, the weather did not cooperate for our first prescribed fire workshop to have that in person, so this recorded presentation will be the next best thing. So I'll be talking about the history of prescribed fire in Wisconsin, as well as fire ecology and fire-dependent ecosystems, fire behavior and ignition patterns, permits and planning, personal protective equipment and safety, and common tools and equipment that you'd run into on a typical prescribed fire. So first off, what is a prescribed fire? The Wisconsin DNR describes it as the intentional application of fire to a specific pre-planned area under specific environmental conditions to accomplish planned land management objectives. Without the use of prescribed burning as a management tool, Wisconsin could lose many of its native grassland, wetland, and savanna plant communities. So something I'd like to point out about this definition is they use the word specific a lot. And that's because we don't go out and light a fire and hope that something good will happen. These fires are planned under very specific weather parameters to achieve a specific land management goal. So prior to European settlement, at least half of Wisconsin was burned on a pretty regular basis. So this map from Landfire shows the historic mean fire interval in Wisconsin. So you can see this kind of S pattern here. In the southern and western part of the state was burned every 3 to 5 years. Um, Whereas the northern half of the state was burned less frequently, but there still is pockets of orange up here that would have been burned on a pretty annual or pretty regular basis from 6 to 12 years. Um, so this map on the left shows the early vegetation of Wisconsin. So this is pre-settlement vegetation. Um, and you can see again this S pattern of mainly prairies, oak savannas, and pine barrens. And that corresponds pretty well to this fire needs assessment map, which shows the areas in red and orange as being the highest priority for burning, and green and the tan as lower priority. So you can see that the habitats that really require fire historically and today are prairies, oak savannas, pine barrens, pine forests as well up in the northern part of the state. So now I have a side-by-side of the historic land cover of Wisconsin versus a land cover map that shows the land cover now. So the yellow on this map has been replaced as agriculture land. So in the previous map, the main chunks of land were prairies, oak savannas, and pine barrens in this yellow region, whereas now this southern chunk of the state is mainly agricultural land. And there's only small pockets of this pink grass and shrub cover, and it's pretty difficult to find any of this brown barrens on this map here. So we can see that the cover types in Wisconsin have changed significantly. As an example, a little bit closer to home is the Empire Prairie or Wisconsin's 20-mile prairie. So Arlington's right here and Goose Pond would be in that area. And you can see that the Empire Prairie extended all the way from Columbus down past Wanakee. Um, this map was made by Tom Brock and retrieved from his blog on the Pleasant Valley Conservancy website. And it shows the remaining prairie remnants as well as the boundary of what was the Empire Prairie. Um, so some historical accounts of the Empire Prairie can be found in The Prairie and Its People, which describes the land and the life of the early settlers of this region. So Henry Merrill, he made several overland trips to Chicago and Milwaukee. And in 1834, he described the region by saying, "We struck the prairie, which to me was a beautiful sight. Here we could see a grass plot for 4 or 5 miles and not a tree or a bush on it. Then again, as we passed on, we could see orchards, as it were, the grass up to our horses' mouths so that they would nip at it as we rode upon the jump. We passed over some fine prairies. In many places they looked like cultivated fields. We could see an orchard in the distance, and before I knew it, I was frequently looking for the house, not realizing that there was none from 15 to 20 miles ahead of us." Another account of the Empire Prairie from a woman named Mrs. Kinsey. "We entered upon what was known as the 20-mile prairie, and I may be permitted to observe that the miles are wonderfully long on the prairies. Our passage over this was, except the absence of sand, like crossing the desert. Mile after mile of unbroken expanse, not a tree, not a living object except ourselves. Thus we went on, one little knoll rising beyond another, from the summit of each of which in succession we hoped to describe the distant woods, which were to us as the promised land." So both of these accounts describe this vast and open landscape that clearly we do not see as much of today. Um, and these open landscapes, something like a desert with not a tree or a bush on it, require fire to remain that way. And the suppression of fire in the last 150 years has really changed those landscapes that you saw in the maps ahead of time. And these descriptions of a 20-mile prairie just do not exist today. So this map shows that about the same area that the map from Tom Brock showed of the Empire Prairie. And you can see this yellow color here is the vast majority of the land cover that crops. The herb cover, which in this case would represent grasslands, are just small pockets scattered. So this is Goose Pond right here. So this is Ankenbrandt Prairie, Hopkins, Sue Ames, and the others. Schenenberg Marsh and Erstad Prairie up here. And so if this were the Empire Prairie, we would have had an orange block all the way across here, which now is mainly agricultural land. So how did the fires start? Why was the Empire Prairie able to persist pre-European settlement? And as this picture shows, it's people, but back before European settlement, Mark Martin was not burning the prairies. Instead, it was in the indigenous communities. So here's a map of the tribes in Wisconsin. And so Goose Pond is within the Ho-Chunk region. And there's a lot of reasons that indigenous peoples used fire in Wisconsin and all around the US, including clearing land for crops, improving grazing and forage for game species, directing game migration, clearing brush for easier travel, and actually managing the land for specific plant and animal species. I'd also like to note that a lot of sources point to lightning strikes as being a large contributor to the fires in Wisconsin, but that really wasn't the main reason that the fires happened, especially every 3 to 5 years. Lightning strikes are just not that common. So it really was the indigenous peoples of the region who managed the land and allowed open habitats like prairie savannas, pine barrens to persist. So in addition to displacing indigenous peoples from the land that they stewarded, fire suppression is also apparent in the legislation. So I have a couple examples here of legislation that was passed to suppress fire and actually make it illegal to burn. So the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1850 was an act passed in California which outlawed the intentional burning in the newly formed state. There's even an account of a U.S. forest ranger suggesting that people who set fire to the land should be shot. The Bushfire Act of 1874 in British Columbia made it so that anyone caught burning was subject to a $100 fine or 3 months in prison. And the Weeks Act of 1911 outlawed Native American fire management and called for fire protection efforts through federal, state, and private cooperation. So this is a source that I got from a presentation by Paul Presley from he's the wildland fuel specialist, the wildland fire program of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. So there's a couple quotes in here that shows exactly how fire was suppressed at the same time as suppressing indigenous peoples in Minnesota. So this quote here says, "It is the desire of this office that you use your best endeavors to prevent the Indians so far as possible from causing forest or prairie fires on any of the reservations under your charge." Clearly, the suppression of indigenous peoples and their fire stewardship really affected the landscapes and the cover types that we see today. Fire suppression is, of course, also in popular culture with Smokey the Bear. So this is a poster that says, "God gave us this, don't give us this. Remember, only you can prevent forest fires." And I would just like to point out on this before image here that there's a number of fire-dependent species in this picture. First of all, we look at the forest here and we can see that it's super nice and open. It's not taken over by the understory plants. And there's salmon or trout swimming in that stream, which also require fire to create their complex stream habitats. The quail over here require fire so that they can actually move around, forage and nest in a more open environment. So it's really important to acknowledge that prescribed fire is not against preventing forest fires. It's actually something that can help prevent forest fires, better manage the forests, and the idea of this open habitat existing without fire is inaccurate. So why do we continue to burn today? There's quite a few benefits to plants as laid out by the Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council. So maintaining the herbaceous structure and or open nature of fire adapted plant communities. So that's by helping remove brush and other woody vegetation, increasing plant diversity and habitat heterogeneity, restoring and upholding ecological resilience, creating open pockets of bare ground, increasing seed to soil contact, reducing competition for slower growing native trees such as oaks, recycling nutrients from burned fuels back into the soil, reducing the presence of fire-intolerant non-natives, increasing soil carbon content, and increasing groundwater recharge. The Wisconsin Prescribed Fire Council also lays out some benefits to wildlife, including reducing shrub and tree growth, creating open habitat for upland game and waterfowl species, stimulating the growth of flowering forbs, which attracts a variety of pollinators, invertebrates, and seed-eating birds, improving plant productivity, which increases fledgling success for grassland nesting birds, creating heterogeneous forest structure benefiting a wide range of closed and open woodland species, and creating open pockets of bare ground, increasing diversity and richness of ground foraging, seed-eating small mammals and birds. I'd also like to point out that some of these benefits also benefit us at Goose Pond. So improving plant productivity and stimulating the growth of flowering forbs, both of those things are super helpful when it comes to seed collecting. Because if you have a patch and you spend 2 hours collecting seed in a burned versus an unburned area, you're going to come back with drastically different amounts of seed, even though you're spending the same amount of time collecting it. So that's super important when you're planning to plant dozens of acres of prairie. So now I'll talk about a couple habitat types in Wisconsin that depend on fire. So of course we have the prairies, which is the main cover type at Goose Pond. And as I mentioned before, with some of the benefits of prescribed fire, it helps maintain an open habitat clear of brush, which is really important for grassland nesting birds like meadowlarks, northern harriers, but it's also super important in maintaining certain plant species that require open habitat without getting crowded out by or shaded out by brush. So we have the state threatened pale purple coneflower, wild lupin, silphium plants, and wood betony. And all of those plants are really important in supporting pollinator species like the endangered rusty patched bumblebee, the Carner blue butterfly, and the silphium borer moth. So all of these insect species depend on these plants for their survival, and without fire, the plants that they require would not persist. And it's important to note that in the short term, these insect populations will suffer from a burn, but in the long term, if there is no fire, there won't be any of the plants that they require to survive. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. So Wisconsin's wetlands also depend on fire to maintain the open structure, which makes it easier for birds to forage and nest, as well as reptiles and amphibians to get around more easily in the wetlands. So oak communities, as we mentioned before, if there was not fire, oak species, which take a lot longer to grow than something like a maple, would be shaded out and would not persist. Other species like the box turtles, bluebirds, and glass lizards require the open nature of an oak savanna or oak barren to survive. And lastly, pine communities, which I definitely don't know as much about. However, I will mention that jack pines have developed cones that are filled with resin and require the heat of a fire in order to open and release their seeds. So that's a very clear adaptation to fire in pine communities. But as those maps showed as well, pine barrens in the southern and northern parts of the state require fire to remain open, and they require it pretty regularly, every 3 to 5 years. So I mentioned before that we would talk more about insect populations and prescribed fire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about refugia. So what refugia or fire refugias are landscape elements that remain unburned or minimally affected by fire, thereby supporting post-fire ecosystem function, biodiversity, and resilience to disturbances. So these are areas of permanent or semi-permanent unburned areas that allow a refuge for insects to either fly to or get to for safety. However, if a large portion of insects perish in the burn, then it provides a pocket of land that surviving insects can repopulate. So a couple things that we consider to minimize the negative impacts on insect populations is the size of the unit and the area burned. So this is especially important for small remnants. If you have a small 2-acre remnant, you wouldn't want to burn that entire remnant and knock out an entire insect population that depends on that remnant, especially because nowadays typically these remnants are surrounded by agricultural lands or just are largely fragmented from other prairies, and so it would be pretty difficult for insects to repopulate in such a small fragmented area. Frequency of burning, so you want to give the insects time to repopulate. Spatial arrangement, which I'll talk more about on the next slide, as well as temporal arrangement, so not always burning at the same time of year. If you burn in the spring, maybe the next burn will be in the fall or something like that. I'll be using our wood family prairie at Goose Pond as an example to talk about fire intervals as well as refugia. So wood family is about 60 acres of restored prairie, but we have it cut into 6 burn units of about 11 to 8 acres each. So if we're looking at this unit or this chunk of land, we wouldn't want to burn all 6 of these units, all 60 acres at once, because smaller insects are not going to be able to fly over to the next prairie or across the road to the next prairie in time. So you'd be really hurting a lot of insects in that burn and not giving them any place to go. So instead, say if we burned this unit here, unit 6, we would want to keep a nearby unit like unit 5 or unit 3 unburned, so that they have places to either repopulate or possibly escape to. We also wouldn't want to burn 2 big chunks together, because again, that just creates more of an area for a lot of insects to not be able to escape in time. So for example, last year we burned unit 6 and unit 2. This upcoming year, we're going to leave unit 2 unburned. However, we're going to burn unit 6 again. And that's because there's quite a lot of sweet clover in unit 6, and fire does stimulate that growth. So if you burn it again in the next year, you can hurt the new plants that are just coming up. But I'd like to reiterate that although in the short term, you can really see a negative impact on these insect populations, they do still require fire to survive, because if there was not fire, the plants that they depend on would not persist and they would subsequently die. So it's harmful in the short term, but in the long term, it's necessary. So now we'll talk a little bit about fire behavior. So fire needs three things in order to ignite, and that is heat, fuel, and oxygen. However, this fire triangle has been called now a fire tetrahedron because of this chemical reaction, which is also required for fire to happen. And this fire triangle over here shows a little bit more in detail. So the fuel, so that would be something like the grass or woody material that would be burned in the fire. So the amount of that fuel, the arrangement of the fuel, and the moisture level in the fuel will all impact fire behavior. Topography will also impact fire behavior. The slope or aspect of the land, so whether it's a south facing or north facing slope, how much sun it's getting, and also fire acts pretty different on hills versus flat land. So fire tends to climb rapidly up a hill versus moving more slowly and predictably on flat ground. The weather, so when we're planning for a burn, we look at the wind speed, temperature, humidity, and precipitation to know if the fuel is going to burn at all or if it's going to burn in a containable way. So now I'll talk more about specific ignition patterns and types of fires. So first, the backing fire. So if we see that the wind is coming from the north and going towards the south, a backing fire would be lit on the south line and be literally backing into the wind, so moving in the opposite direction of the wind. And because the fire has to do more work essentially to spread, this is a pretty slow moving fire, and because of that, it has the most complete combustion, and it's pretty manageable. So backing fires are typically the very first fire that you'll ignite on a standard ring fire burn to establish this black back line. So flanking fires are fires that are lit parallel to the wind, but the actual fire moves perpendicular to the wind. So these ones are kind of moderate intensity fires. They're more intense than a backing fire, but less intense than the head fire. So this shows all of them together. If the wind direction again is moving from the north to the south, the head fire would be lit on that north line and then move in the direction with the wind. So with the wind going behind it, head fires are the fastest spreading, the most intense, and the hottest fires. Whereas you can see here again, flanking fire is lit parallel to the wind, but moves perpendicular to it. And the backing fire backs into the wind. So strip heading fire is a technique in burning a unit in which people would be staggered. And so this guy here would light this line of head fire first. So this line would move quickly into the road. This guy would be lighting second. And so this strip would eventually run into this burned area. and then the last one here would start igniting this line last, and this fire would burn into that one. I'd like to note on this map that they have the fire breaks around the unit. They also are using a road as a fire break. And so roads are a very effective fire break because fire isn't going to burn on asphalt, but it's also important to note that smoke management is a huge part of prescribed fire. And at Goose Pond, we would never be lighting right along a busy road like that, especially with the wind going right to it. So this is more so just showing a break rather than the actual road. There'd be more thought put into that. Spot firing is very similar to the strip firing. These people are lighting staggered again, but this is a less intense way to fill that space. So instead of lighting an entire strip, you just drop a little spot and then it'll spread out, drop a spot, it'll spread out. So it fills the space, but not as intense as a full strip would. So most of the burns that we do at Goose Pond are ring fire burns, which uses all of the techniques that we mentioned previously. So in this example, the wind is coming from this direction and pushing here. So if we were burning this unit, we would start at the furthest point downwind, and one crew would go this way, one crew would go the other way, and we would establish this back line. So as you can see, this chunk here is the back line, and it has a nice area of black that when that head fire is lit, it'll hit and not keep moving. So next, each team would get to their corner and begin lighting flanking fire. And once they get to this corner here, that would be referred to as the point of commitment. And that means that that is when you are committing to lighting the head fire. So at that point, you want to make sure that your drip torch is full of fuel, you've got water, the crew is ready, and they have water in their back cans or the pumper unit, whatever you're using. And you turn the corner and you light the head fire, and the ring of fire closes in on itself and pulls together. As I mentioned before, you can't just go out and light a fire and hope for the best. There's a lot of planning that is involved. So before the day of the burn, you should have a burn plan. If you need a DNR special burning permit, which we do at Goose Pond, you'll need that. Insurance, the burn break should be established, whether that's mowed trails, hand line, or other burn breaks. And there should be a map of the unit that shows safety hazards, escape routes, and safety zones. On the day of the burn, before starting the test fire, again, you should check the DNR burning restrictions on Wisburn, which I will open this. So this shows the fire danger within each county. So today in Columbia County, it's moderate, but this shows the DNR protected area. So these areas in white do not have to worry about special burning permits to burn, but Columbia County, so where we are in Goose Pond, does. So we need to make sure before we start a test fire on that day that we are cleared and good to burn. So this tool is really good for checking safety conditions. So we also need to notify the sheriff and local fire departments so that they know that we're burning, they know that this is a planned burn, and if they get calls from concerned citizens, that they can tell them that it's a prescribed fire and not to worry. Similarly, we put out prescribed fire signs on the nearby roads or busy roads that people would be likely to see the smoke. Again, so they don't start calling the sheriff and fire departments reporting what they believe is a wildfire. We confirm the weather conditions and make sure that they are what we would like in the prescription to burn. We check that all equipment is working and personnel are present, and we brief the fire crew. And what that refers to is we go over safety zones, hazards, escape routes, and we walk or drive the burn breaks. And after the burn, we mop up, so we make sure that everything is extinguished before we leave the unit, and we debrief with the fire crew to go over any mistakes that were made, how we can improve, things that we did well, and just in general to learn from the burn that day. So this go/no-go checklist sums up all of this stuff that I talked about, and it's essentially just a way to make sure before you burn that everything that should be prepared and ready is, so that you can burn safely. Here is an example of one of our burn maps. So this is Brown Prairie Unit 3. In blue, we have the burn break shown on the map, as well as safety zones, in this case, the driveway, parking lot, and the road. I also, though, have a special concern on the road for smoke, to make sure that we're not putting a bunch of smoke on the road, which would impact drivers. I'd also like to note that, of course, the road is a safety zone in the sense that like fire isn't going to burn on it, but it's important to still realize that it's a road, cars are driving on it, so use caution. I also have on here vehicle access points, here, here, and here, as well as structures within the unit that we would want the crew to be aware of. So we have a bird box here. So whoever is on this line knows that it's coming up and knows that they'll have to burn around it and protect it, as well as a bench and some signs right there. I talked a bit about how Columbia County and Goose Pond is in the DNR fire restricted area. So this is a map of what those areas are. So we're right here in yellow, which means that burning permits are required January 1st through May 31st. So we have to make sure that we have all the required permits for burning in the spring and early summer, but that in the fall we do not have to worry about permits. And then we have personal protective equipment, very important to stay safe and comfortable on a burn. So, of course, the yellow jumpsuit is Nomex, which is made of a material that should not burn easily. Can also see sometimes people have Nomex shirts and the green Nomex pants. Then some sort of face covering is really important for the smoke, whether that's a cloth mask or a bandana. But of course, whatever material that mask is made of has to be 100% cotton or other natural materials that aren't going to melt and potentially melt onto your skin. and a hard hat. Not as relevant for a lot of goose pond burns because they're open prairie habitats, but these helmets are especially important in woodland or savanna burns where there could be something burning overhead of you that could fall. Leather gloves, of course, to protect your hands from the heat, and safety glasses, which can help with the smoke. Leather boots, of course. Again, natural materials are super important, so synthetics don't melt, burn a hole right through them. And radios, although this isn't typically what you would think of as PPE, the radio is one of the most important parts of staying safe on a prescribed fire. It's really important that if you have a radio on a prescribed fire that you use it, and you respond to line bosses, burn bosses, and just generally know what's going on around you. And water, also, you just have to stay hydrated, because you don't want to be overheating or passing out on a prescribed fire. It's not good for anyone involved. Since the in-person portion of this workshop was canceled, I'll be going over what we would have shown you during the workshop, which is some of the tools that are commonly used in prescribed fire. So of course the drip torch is the thing that's igniting the fires and spreading them. So a couple of things to note is that it's important to fill the drip torches only 3/4 full because gas expands and the pressure will build up inside. So that bit of room allows that. And so the drip torch fuel is a mixture of diesel and gasoline. The gas helps carry the flame from the torch to the ground, whereas the diesel provides a longer residual burn time. The typical ratio that we use is 60-40. So if we were making 5 gallons of drip torch fuel, we would do about 3 gallons of diesel to 2 gallons of gasoline. So we also, of course, need water to keep the fire contained and in case of spot fires. So depending who you burn with or what you're burning or where you're burning, you might use vehicles with these pumper units or backpack pumper units. So these are for establishing a wet line or putting out spot fires. So this is kind of like a super soaker. You just spray it with your hands, whereas this has a hose attachment that you would just carry the hose and walk alongside the vehicle. And then we have the flapper. So it's important to conserve water on burns. So sometimes all you need to do is smother the flame with a flapper instead of spray it with water. So flappers, despite their name, you don't flap them. So you wouldn't want to hold them up real high and slam it down because that's just gonna give the fire oxygen as well as spread ash and other burning materials and possibly cause a spot fire. So you're really just using these flappers to smother the flame. Rakes help remove fuel from a line, so you don't want a lot of fuel buildup along your brake, so you might rake that into the unit so that it doesn't escape. The Kestrel records the weather at the actual site of the burn to make sure that all parameters are being met, wind speed, temperature, and humidity. And then I also included this leaf blower, which we have used less so on the actual burn and more so just preparing the breaks. So if there's a lot of leaf litter in the breaks or corn litter in the breaks, we use these leaf blowers to get that out of there so that the fire doesn't creep across. So the final takeaways, beyond just the fact that fire is super necessary to conserve Wisconsin ecosystems, for our sake at Goose Pond and for a lot of other organizations, volunteers are so important. At Goose Pond specifically, you know, if we didn't have enough volunteers to do a burn, we would just not be able to burn, which would be very sad to miss a good burning day just because we don't have the people to do it. So I'd like to note on that anybody who wants to get involved has a place on a burn, whether you've been burning for 30 years or have never burned at all. We provide on the ground training, and even if you wouldn't like to participate directly in a burn, you know, more eyes are always helpful. So even if you just stand at the place that we started the fire and make sure that everything's out and nothing's creeping across, that's also very helpful. So that's just say, just never feel discouraged. If you want to help on a burn and you've never done it before, we can train you and we can find a role that fits what you'd like to get out of it. But also, if you don't directly help on burns, still just to be an advocate for prescribed fire in Wisconsin and to try to fight the Smokey the Bear mentality a little bit. So thank you for listening, and you can email me with any questions. My email is eraasch@madisonaudubon.org. So thank you again.